Human reproduction is one of the most hotly contested topics globally. According to Amnesty International, debates about abortion, about the family, how to raise children, how mothers are supposed to behave are all over the news around the world. But where does the global media's interest in reproduction come from? With the project Racialized Motherhood, I will produce a first data-driven study of how early newspapers represented motherhood in the early era of mass media, from the mid-17th century to the late 19th century. Why? Attempts to control women's bodies and behavior were a priority of early modern European political, religious, and legal authorities. These attempts at control were enabled by religious mores, behavioral conventions, social expectations that were passed on through discursive practices. That is, how we talk to each other and how we write to each other. That was also the case back then. In the 17th century, in France, for example, women were systematically instructed to avoid sexual or intimate contact. And if they failed to avoid sex, they were instigated to feel guilty for straying away from Christian teachings. In the Dutch Republic, for example, women who were sex workers and who provided services to men belonging to a different religious group were subjected to higher levels of punishment. Pregnancy outside of wedlock was subjected to surveillance across Europe throughout the early modern period. In the 18th century, in Scotland, for example, communities collaborated with religious and political authorities to keep an eye on single women who got pregnant. Laws, rules, practices that sought to surveil and control women's reproductive capacity were a widespread reality in early modern Europe. Newspapers captured discursive traces of this reality over time. Religious and legal and cultural discourses categorizing people through various discernible signs have existed across Europe for a long time before the modern concept of race. And as a cultural construct, these ideas of heritability have been in circulation since well before we acquired an understanding of genetics. Concerns over women's sexuality and reproduction are linked to these long-term discursive developments. These ideas first developed within their local cultural horizons, and they were often circumscribed by linguistic borders, and they reflected idiosyncrasies of belief and of law that were prevalent in these regions. But once Europeans started to settle in the Americas and also to impose themselves politically, these European notions started to influence how life was organized in the colonies there, which gave rise to new systems of separating humans into categories and also organizing life in society, which ended up opening the door for enslaved women's bodies to be exploited as reproductive apparatuses. And here, there's an additional concern that comes into play. Enslaved women played a crucial role for the economic gain of the metropoles that exploited slavery. Not only were women of great economic importance as workers, but they also were important as reproductive bodies. Several slave codes, for example, such as those of Virginia and Barbados, that were controlled by the British, also the case of the Code Noir in the French Empire, employed a legal principle called in Latin, partus sequitur ventrem, which means the offspring follows the womb. And this means that a child that was born from an enslaved woman with a free man would be born enslaved, whereas the child of a free woman with an enslaved man would be born free. That is, the child would have the status of the mother. In the case of the Portuguese Empire, though they lacked a unified slave code in Brazil, they also used a similar principle. In Brazil, there was this principle of the child having the status of the mother. And this only changed in that case in the 1870s. It's quite late when this practice was abolished with a law that was called, I translated into English, the law of the free womb. That means that the women would continue to be enslaved, but their children would be born free. Enslaved women in the colonies that were controlled by the British Empire were systematically exploited as producers of babies, who were seen as new enslavable bodies. The Portuguese Empire in colonial Brazil focused on securing the traffic of enslaved people from Africa to the new continent, but also on exploiting enslaved women's reproductive capacity as a lucrative colonial enterprise. There are historical evidence of sexual ties between European enslavers and enslaved women from Africa or from African descent, and this exists in the archives in Danish, Dutch, French, and Brazilian that were from these empires. So archives from these geographical contexts from the early modern period. And this indicates that rape sometimes was instrumentalized by the enslaver for profit. The colonial interest in enslaved women's reproductive capacity made them prone to be represented in newspapers. But these representations very rarely portrayed them as full human beings. They were rather represented as objects of commercial speculation and exchange, along with their reproductive capacity. With racialized motherhood, I will make a comprehensive trans-imperial account of how the reproductive capacity of women of European origin was, through language, discursively differentiated over time from the reproductive capacity of women of African origin in the newspapers from the mid-17th century to the late 19th century. And the main research question that I will pursue is, how did these early modern newspapers represent motherhood for women of different origins over the course of decades and centuries? And for that, I will combine methods from history, which is my discipline, digital humanities, and also historical social linguistics. And I will use a combination of innovations in the empirical, methodological, and theoretical fronts to be able to tackle this question. The analysis that will come from these combined goals will allow me to produce a systematic historical examination of the legacies of racialized discourses on human reproduction, because we still have echoes of this still lingering among us today. And so this project has the potential to lead us through a better understanding, a breakthrough in our understanding of this historical construction of these cultural ideas, and which is what underpins globalized intersectional oppression that takes the shape of racism and misogyny combined against women from African descent or from Africa. The empirical objective of the project is to document, analyze, and explain geographical and diachronic changes on these patterns of discourse about women's reproductive and caring roles during the early modern period, which was the main period of a colonial exploitation. And this, why? Because in a time before reliable birth controls, reproductive and caring roles were often represented in these media as women's main responsibility in life. And so in Racialized Motherhood, I will first investigate how these roles were represented in writing for women of different ethno-racial backgrounds and from different diverse geopolitical contexts. And I also will expose the relationship between these discursive representations across time and space. So basically, the idea is to see, did one location influence the other? Did discourse from these different places mix and mingle and influence each other? My approach to empirical sources innovates because it embraces this transimperial scope of analysis of discursive patterns of motherhood. I will have to build data sets that will be fit to cross-examine discursive patterns in print that were in French, in English, in Portuguese, Dutch, and Danish, and Spanish, because they came from these empires, right? So they used these languages in writing. And these newspapers were printed and circulated on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was more or less over the course of 250 years. The goal is to examine systematically how the discursive patterns spread, and if they did. The methodological objective of the project is to do a data-driven comparative analysis of these discourses, because we need to combine balanced corpus with a representative corpus. But that's not enough, because we also need to pay attention to the details. So the data-driven part of the project will serve to guide the subsequent in-depth analysis that will come from the methods of history, mostly through microhistory, close reading, and source criticism. Why is this important? Because the current standard practice in the discipline of natural language processing, or computational linguistics, is to grab as much text as possible from the largest corpora possible without too much concern for documenting what is in this. So you have probably heard about web crawling and things like that. So we get everything that can be got out there from the web, but that's not necessarily very effective for a historical project, because without this documentation of what's in there, of what made those models possible, it's not possible for the historian to then go and do a deep dive, to do close reading and do source criticism on the material. And so with this project, I will combine the objectives and needs of the two disciplines so that we can collaborate and bring about innovations on both sides. The ideal is to combine the strengths of each, the macro and the micro, so that we can come up with insights that are actually reflecting of the realities of the past and also of the realities of today. Finally, the theoretical objective of my project is to innovate by allowing a framework that allows me to analyze discourses on different axes of representation. So I already talked a little bit about the geographical scope, that's quite wide. The diachronic scope is also quite long. We have 250 years of newspapers to analyze. But then when we actually go to the text, it's also important to take into account the difference in representation of women's intersecting identities. And in this case, what I will do is to combine gender, ethno-racial identity, socioeconomic standing, and religion. How did these aspects of women's identity were represented in these different newspapers? And what are the silences and expressed information that we can find? First, we have to look at what was out there, and then the subsequent step is to analyze it. So just to give you a few examples, more recently there have been a lot of efforts in digitizing these newspapers, and they have been slowly being made available. We have some newspapers, for example, Mercure Galant, Gazette de Paris, they are in French. We have Amsterdam Courant or the Curaçao Courant, they are in Dutch or English, mixed actually, the both languages inside. We have, for example, Sanctomatinene, which also mixes Danish and English. Quebec Gazette mixes French and English. So you have also this complexity within the sources, mixing different languages. The intersectional analysis will come from analyzing different aspects of how women's identity were represented, like gender, ethno-racial identity, religion, and socioeconomic standing. And also, the idea is to see if these representations started to migrate within the different areas. And can we see if the newspapers had a role in these different ways of calling these realities, right? This framework that is informed by critical race theory allows me to uncover evidence of discursive processes by which African women came to be perceived as racialized and European women came to be perceived as racially neutral in these colonial contexts. And also to allow us to explain how these processes took place in language in the print media, in the early era of print media over time. Supported by this intersectional framework, representative microhistorical cases will be selected for in-depth study. Until today, patterns that were not perceptible will be uncovered through the data-driven stage of the work, and then will receive careful, close attention, where we will be able to cross-reference the material with other historical sources. And this combination of micro and macro will allow us to have different insights from what we have nowadays. This will be a first project that will contribute a trans-imperial analysis of the history of racist discourses on human reproduction and also on the reproductive exploitation of enslaved women during the colonial period. It will also allow our team to incorporate the practical disciplinary concerns from history and from the computation into the development of the computational tools that we will use in the project. And also on how these tools are going to be engaged for the project. So there's an ethical aspect in there too. Racialized motherhood addresses the urgent need for this trans-imperial historical examination of discourses on women's reproductive capacities. But this, for women in general, but especially for the difference between enslaved women and free women through time and through space. Together, the different objectives that I have in this project will help me significantly expand the state of the art of the early modern on the history of the early modern discourses on women's reproductive capacities. And I think it will also help us set new quality standards for the engaging of digital history methods for the discipline, for when we produce microhistorical accounts. The project's contribution goes beyond exposing and examining what can be seen in historical source material from the isolated empires and colonies, because it highlights the interconnectedness. I forgot to pass the slides. Okay, there. It highlights the interconnectedness of these trans-imperial discursive processes of racialization. And I think the project has the potential to unravel a comprehensive understanding of the discursive development of racialized language on reproduction that we still see in use today. Thank you very much.